Hello and welcome to React Native Radio. I'm your host, Nader Dabbit. Today we're going to be talking with some folks from Hasura. So our two special guests today are going to be Tanmai, Gopal, and Wawhal. Welcome to the show, guys.
Hey everybody. Hi, Nader.
Hi,
Hey,
nice being
what's
here.
up? Yeah, cool. Thanks for coming on. Yeah, so Hasura, we have a bunch of folks listening that typically may or may not be into the full stack ecosystem in GraphQL. So they may or may not have heard of Hasura. Can you kind of give us each an introduction of who you are and how you got into maybe programming, and then maybe a quick intro, one of you into what Hasura is, what the elevator pitch is?
Absolutely. So I'll just start off with an intro and then talk about Hasura a little later. So I'm Tanmai. I am one of the founders at Hasura, and we started building what we have today, the Hasura GraphQL engine, quite a few years ago. The idea was to kind of get up and running with an API quickly. We used to do JSON stuff before, but we added GraphQL stuff early this year, and we open sourced it just 3 months ago. And that's kind of since when we've been in the community, helping people kind of build applications with GraphQL. So I got into programming since my university days. I think it's been 10 years now since I started coding. I studied computer science in university, so I had to code then for better or worse. And then thankfully I liked it. So here I am. Rishi?
Well, hi, I'm Rishi. I've been I work as an engineer at Hasura, and I'm kind of a full stack developer, more on the front end sides of things. I do a lot of React, a lot of React Native. And yeah, that's pretty much it. I got into programming. I code from a very long time, 10, 11 years, but that was all like recreational. So I am a physics major, by the way. And then I ended up joining Tanmai to work with Hasura. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Very cool. Tell me about Hasura. What is the company? Obviously, there's some remote work going on because I know one of you is in San Francisco and then the other one is across the world, the globe. What kind of company is Hasura? How did it start? And where does everyone work and things like that? And I know one of you are the founders, so that's pretty cool.
Yep. So we incorporated just about slightly more than a year and a few months ago. A bunch of us from the team used to run a services and consulting firm before we started Hasura. And then we hired a bunch more people that joined us when we incorporated and over the year. So I think we're about 20-ish people now. Most of us are in Bangalore, where Rishi is at the moment. And some of us shuttle back and forth from the Bay Area to Bangalore. So I'm currently in San Francisco. I have to spend half my time here and half my time in Bangalore. So it's a little bit of a nightmare to travel. But one day I can afford business class and then everything will be okay. Then I can travel as much as possible. But right now it's good old fashioned traveling for 20 hours across to the other side of the world. So we started off building a Kubernetes platform for helping people get productive on Kubernetes quickly. And one of the components that we had was this kind of, automated API generation on a database, so that you can build your app quickly. Kind of like the Firebase and the parse idea that, that front-end developers really love, that I used to really like using. And kind of that idea, but on your own database, right? So instead of you being locked into a cloud database and you can't really own your data or the database. So you would have your own database that you could use, that you could have APIs on. We added GraphQL support recently too. So that's kind of where Hasura started. And that's kind of what our team has been up to over the last 15 months.
Okay, cool. So is this kind of the first company that you've started, or have you done this in the past? And how did you kind of get interested in this type of stuff?
So this is my second company, technically. Right out of college, I did some freelance consulting for a year. And then after that, a bunch of us started services in a consulting firm. So we used to, build applications for people, for small startups or large enterprises who wanted to build out an MVP. And then we were super early adopters in the Docker and Kubernetes ecosystem. And then we kind of used that to start doing more enterprise consulting for people who are moving to the new world, quote unquote. And then we were doing that for a few years. And while we were doing that, we were kind of building these, we were building small tools and technology pieces and libraries. And that was where the idea was that, hey, what is the set of things that we can build that can accelerate full stack development, right? Everything from ops to backend development to the database side of things to the front end side of things, right? And so we built a bunch of things. And we realized that, it seems like we have enough now to try to build a product out of this, and a platform or a bunch of open source components. And that was the plan. And when we realized that we'd reached that kind of maturity, we already had a bunch of these in production for fairly large scale applications. So we said, okay, cool, let's start Hasura and let's not do the services stuff anymore. So we stopped doing that, and then we kind of restructured and started working on Hasura. And then we kind of started that off as a platform that had a bunch of these components put together. So in a sense, we kind of came up with this because we wanted to solve our own problems, and we kind of validated that those were real problems. So it kind of came out of that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think a lot of people get into building their own products in a similar fashion, from what I've heard.
Right.
Filling a void or building something maybe that they're already interested in having and that isn't already out there. So GraphQL, a lot of people are getting into GraphQL. It seems really hot. I know that we may be in a bubble, but I hear so much about it. But I also know that the people that I follow on Twitter are prone to be interested in the newest and hottest technology. Can you kind of talk about why you chose GraphQL as an implementation of this idea?
Right. So we actually had started this by having JSON APIs on the database. That's kind of what we started with. So we would have HTTP endpoint, and then we would send a JSON payload. So instead of, how the GraphQL query string has like a, query, profile, ID, and name, right? For example, instead of doing that, what you would do is you would send a JSON payload that would say type query. We used to call it type select. And then we would say table, profile, and then we'd say columns, which would be an array. And the array would take ID, name. And then you'd have another field called arguments, which would have an array of arguments, right? Or an object of arguments. And so that's kind of the API that we built with JSON, right? And every time I would describe this, or we would use this or we would describe this, it would seem like I'm just describing what GraphQL is, right? I'd be like, hey, you have one API and you can make whatever query you want to fetch across relationships and fetch all the data in one shot. And then I'm like, hey, that's exactly what GraphQL says it is. And then we describe, okay, this is why the query structure is very flexible. And that's exactly what GraphQL does as well. And so we realized that we should add GraphQL support because GraphQL is just a perfect fit for what we're doing. In hindsight, I think the big reason behind why GraphQL is so popular and why it made sense for us to use GraphQL, and we wrote a blog post about this called, if you're thinking about hand-rolling your own JSON DSL, don't use GraphQL instead. And that kind of insights that our team had after having done this with JSON first. And one of the big things around GraphQL, which you won't see, in other things, like you had Netflix doing Falcor, you had OData as a spec that would allow you to kind of have these similar benefits of GraphQL as avoiding N+1 queries from the client and stuff like that. But the reason why GraphQL is such a big deal in our eyes is that you have structured language that you're sending to the backend. And the backend not only responds to queries for data or mutations on data or subscriptions, but the backend also respects introspection. And that, I think, is one of the absolutely like the most killer feature, right? Which is that you can actually query the backend and say, hey, what are the models that you have? And, describe them to me programmatically, give me the data structure that these models have. And then the backend responds to you with that information. And that idea is so powerful because as soon as you have a backend that has to be introspectable, right? Imagine if every single REST API in the world also served its own Swagger spec automatically, right? And that idea is very powerful because then suddenly the community went crazy over the last 2 years, and the community has been building some amazing tools to use that. So you have things that visualize your GraphQL API. You have clients that are type safe and that have caching built into them. You have ID tooling that gives you autocomplete for an API, right? Like autocomplete for an API is almost unheard of. You could only have autocomplete for your code, but you have autocomplete for an API that you have. So in that sense, GraphQL is amazing, right? Because the API experience is absolutely amazing for a front-end developer that's using it in their application. I mean, I'm a recent, but at least almost everybody at Hasura, we're fairly recent to the GraphQL bandwagon. So we weren't drinking the Kool-Aid for a while. And then when we started drinking the Kool-Aid, we were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Like, this makes so much sense. There are obviously rough edges, but it makes a lot of sense.
Also, one more very attractive feature about GraphQL is subscriptions. They have defined the spec for subscriptions, so the client knows what the events will be, what the events it should emit. Like, there doesn't have to be a separate implementation the way you typically do with a REST API.
Right, yeah. And if people are unfamiliar with what subscriptions are, it's basically a way to do real-time data, something like implementation of WebSockets, but it's just built into the spec and it works. And it's kind of like straightforward and it's really nice for modern APIs. So with GraphQL, what are the benefits of using something like Hasura? I mean, to me, it's pretty straightforward. You don't want to spend a ton of time building and implementing a new GraphQL API from scratch. You want to have something to start with. That's kind of my look at what Hasura provides. But kind of, can you give me like an idea of why someone would use Hasura as opposed to building out their own API or something like that?
So I think it's pretty much exactly as you said. What Hasura does is Hasura is like a super lightweight open source service. You deploy it and you point it to your database. And as soon as you do that, you get a GraphQL API that supports very rich CRUD operations and real time, gives you subscriptions on anything in the database. So we do live queries and subscriptions on anything that changes in the database. So that's just one portion of your GraphQL API that you now don't have to worry about. And that's the main idea. So anybody looking at kind of, accelerating feature velocity on the front end side of things, which is the purpose of GraphQL, but also without having to build a GraphQL API that supports like a bunch of easy querying in real time. That's where Hasura fits in perfectly. And that's kind of, so the experience is that you point that to the database, you maybe create a few tables on our UI that we have, or you load in your tables into the database through your favorite tooling. And then as soon as you do that, you get your GraphQL endpoints that will give you queries, which allow you to select data, mutations, which allow you to insert, update, or delete data, including complicated things like upsert, which is update or insert. So you try to insert, but if it already exists, then update instead. Or things like aggregations, where you want to fetch, the average of a certain set of rows in your data, or, you want to count how many things there are that meet a particular condition in your data. So you want to do operations like that. We already have the GraphQL API for that. And of course, real time, and building a scalable real time server on top of an existing database or on top of a database like Postgres is a little bit nuanced and is a little painful to do. We kind of bootstrap that and say, hey, here's a server. You can subscribe to anything in the database, however it changes, right? It could change because of a GraphQL mutation. It could change because somebody is using the database directly through, another backend service, or somebody's just doing database stuff. And anything that changes in the database, you can subscribe to from the client. So that's kind of what we take care of. The reason why Hasura helps you not just get started, but the reason why it's a good GraphQL API is, one, because it has a very good system of authorization built into the GraphQL API. So you can have really flexible access control rules that you set up that will automatically be enforced whenever the app uses the GraphQL query. So if you say, I want a query for profile data, it'll only let you access your own profile. So if you're logged in as user one, you'll only see user one's profile. That's like a simple use case, or in a multi-tenant use case where you have a more complicated application, those kind of permissions work as well. The other big reason is that building a high-performance GraphQL API on a database is still a little bit complicated. And that's because the tooling has still not evolved completely on the server side yet. Like, we're seeing a lot of new tools, but I think patterns around that are still evolving. So we take an approach that lets you query, you can get about 2,000 requests per second on 50 MB of RAM, fetching about 80 KB of data, doing a GraphQL join, like not just fetching a flat top level GraphQL query, but a GraphQL query that's fetching from multiple tables. And that's insanely high on performance. And that also works really well because you're like, hey, so now I have a chunk of my CRUD and real-time API that I don't have to worry about. And if I want to write other custom APIs, I can schema stitch them together and I can have a unified GraphQL API for my app. But at least like a bulk of the painful grunt work, I don't have to do. And that's kind of where Hasura shines as a service that you include in your stack.
Also, coming from the authorization context, Hasura GraphQL Engine is actually an API for the client, not for the backend. Like since it has access control implemented, you can directly contact the Hasura GraphQL APIs from your client. It is not an ORM for your backend. It is directly accessible from the client.
Interesting. So if you want to work with Hasura on the back end, what do you use for the client, though? You probably need to use an existing GraphQL client, something like Apollo or something like Urkel or one of those other clients. Is that kind of right?
Yep. That's what you do if you want to use it from the back end. Although when developers ask us if they want to use Hasura on the back end as well, not just from the front end, we also tell them that they can just use their favorite ORM and connect directly to the database. They don't have to go through Hasura. You can you can just directly use your favorite ORM. Like if you're on Java, you can use JDBC or Active Record for Rails or SQL Alchemy for Python or Django for Python, and just connect to the database directly and everything will still work.
Okay, yeah. So the database is just there, but most of the people using this are probably using it for the client implementation for like real time and things like that, right?
Exactly. Because that's the painful stuff, right? Like you don't want to build a WebSocket server and scale that up. That's you don't want to do that.
Right. So this is React Native Radio. Like we brought you on here because we feel like, this is a good thing to use for mobile applications. And this is more of like a GraphQL thing than a Hasura thing, I would say. But since GraphQL is so good for mobile, building your own GraphQL server sometimes is kind of hard, especially if you're a front-end developer trying to get into this stuff. Can you kind of talk about why mobile developers would look at something like GraphQL as opposed to just a traditional REST API?
Got it. I'm sure that a lot of listeners who are mobile app developers have used things like Firebase and Parse before, right? And I'm sure that especially with Parse, the experience was super easy. With Firebase, it's a little more complicated. But once you get into it, you kind of really love that power, right? And the power that you essentially have is the ability to say, hey, I don't need a backend for like a whole set of things that I need to do. And for most of it, I can just do that straight from my app, right? I can query for whatever data I want. I can change or I can mutate whatever data I want, and it will just work. And especially for if you were using the real-time components, you can be like, hey, I can change something on this side of the app, and it will automatically get changed everywhere else on all the other apps that are being used, right? And you love that experience. You love that experience because it gives you so much power to be able to do exactly what you want, not have to talk to somebody on the back end, get them to build something. So you don't have to do stuff like that, right? And the reason why that was happening or why that was powerful was because the Firebase and Parse had a really nice SDK that you could use on the mobile app that would let you do that, right? Imagine that power, but for any API that you build. And that's why GraphQL is super exciting. So GraphQL lets you say, hey, it's not just on Firebase or Parse anymore, but you might have your own backend. And as long as the backend team gives you a GraphQL API instead of a REST API, when you use the GraphQL API, you'll feel like I can do whatever I want. I can, as long as the data is there, I can query for it. I can make those mutations. I can subscribe to whatever I can subscribe to. And you suddenly feel that freedom where you don't have to talk to your backend team and ask them what the API is or how the API works, or what the structure of the API is, what kind of type it returns, especially for those. I mean, I know this is React Native, but let's say you were doing stuff with Android or Swift, where you needed to create like classes that had for API response types. Your tool will take care of your tooling, your GraphQL client will take care of that for you. So you don't have to actually write out those classes by hand. And that's the experience and that's the joy of using GraphQL. And that's what you'll hear from people who started using GraphQL. And you'll hear that everything just feels so much easier and so much more freeing that you can kind of query for whatever you want. And, you can iterate as much as you want on the front end without needing to talk to your backend team or without needing to iterate on the API. So that's kind of where GraphQL fits in. And where Hasura fits in is saying that, hey, we'll give you that real-time GraphQL API, but on an existing database. So you don't even need your backend team to actually set up the GraphQL API for you. So you can just do it yourself. And for example, if you just head over to our website, you do a deploy to Heroku, you can sign up for a free account on Heroku. It'll take you like 20 seconds. And in another 20 seconds, you'll have a GraphQL endpoint deployed. You'll have a free instance of a database, which is Postgres. You'll have Hasura, which is running for you. You'll have a UI. You can go ahead and make your tables, kind of like what you do with Parse. And then what you can do is you can start using GraphQL queries, mutations, subscriptions automatically. You don't need to write an API for all of the CRUD or real-time stuff that you need to do. So it's a perfect fit, especially if you're looking at getting started building like a rich front-end application or a React Native application that has real-time capabilities. It's ideal for that. But that's kind of an overview of why GraphQL and why Hasura.
Very cool. And I agree 100% on all those points. GraphQL is a perfect fit for mobile application development. It is a little bit of a learning curve if you've never used it before, but using things like Hasura make it a little easier because you don't have to learn how to not only understand the client implementation, but also the backend implementation. It kind of helps you get up and running faster with the backend. And when you're dealing with mobile applications now and you want to build something scalable that people all around the world can use, you really need to kind of take into consideration things like the size of your payload. And using something like GraphQL just makes it that much easier to reduce latency, things like that, just out of the box without you having to put a lot of work into kind of handling that type of stuff on the back-end side. So that's definitely one of the reasons. We're seeing a lot of people pick up GraphQL in the mobile space in general. So React Native, but not only React Native, iOS native, native Android, PWAs, those sorts of things as well.
Absolutely.
So like if someone is building their next React Native app and they want to get up and running with Hasura, with GraphQL, like what would the process look like? So they build their React Native app, they're ready to hook into some API. Like where do they need to go and what do they need to do to kind of get up and running?
So I think like the first thing to do is to decide to choose kind of where you want to host. So Hasura is an open source service, so you can kind of take that and deploy that wherever you like. But I would recommend that if you want to focus more on the front end side of things, just choose Heroku. We have a one click to deploy. So just go ahead and deploy it on Heroku, which will take you just like under a minute, about 30 seconds. And then once you have that, we take a look at your React Native app. And so Rishi and I had done another podcast recently where we actually did we live coded a chat app on React. I think the idea should be fairly similar for React Native, where we live coded a chat app and kind of went through the process of like how to integrate those GraphQL APIs. But the experience is basically like you plan out your app and you build out let's say you've built out the UI for your React Native app. And now what you do is you figure out, okay, when I look at this app, I need to have these kinds of tables that will store this data on my database, right? And it's very intuitive. Like you look at the table and you see like, okay, here's profile. I need to have ID, name, age, number. Every profile has kind of many addresses or has many contacts. And so then you have a contact table, which has a user ID 1 and user ID 2. So it's fairly intuitive. You just kind of build these tables and you set up the columns. And because of the columns, your tables will have like relationships. So first you create the tables. And then as soon as you're done with creating the tables, which our UI gives you, the Hasura UI also lets you kind of create relationships between tables. So you can say that, hey, here's the user table. Here's the contacts table. Every user has many contacts because of the contact table has a user ID column. So you kind of just figure out what columns help you specify the relationships between tables and you create those relationships via the UI. And that's it. You're done. Your GraphQL system is ready. You can start querying, you can start mutating, you can start subscribing to stuff, to anything that you can make a query on, you can subscribe to. These are basically these are more like live queries, less like events. And live queries basically let you say, hey, I want to query for the profile with the ID equal to 1 and their top 10 contacts. And if that's your query, you can convert that to a subscription as well. So if you convert that into a subscription, anytime any of the contacts or the profile data changes, you'll get the new response. So you get the new result if anything changes. And then you can kind of handle that new result and then decide what to do with it on the client, right? So that's kind of what the Hasura experience or integrating it looks like. It's super straightforward. Once you're done with kind of just setting up the basic GraphQL API, integrating it with your app, the next thing to do is think about permissions. So you can plug in whatever authentication system you like. You can use Firebase has Firebase Auth. You can use that. You can use Auth0. You can kind of put in any of these, choose any of these, and integrate that with Hasura. So that way, the authentication APIs for doing your login stuff that can come from another SaaS service. And once you have your login tokens, you can send those tokens to Hasura, and Hasura will take care of enforcing the GraphQL API access is secure. You're only accessing data that you own, or you're only writing to data that you own. So that's kind of what the experience looks like in a nutshell. Do you want to add anything, Rishi?
Well, yeah, also about the client-side libraries, if a React Native developer has to start using GraphQL on the client side, they will need to look into what client-side library they would want to use, because one of the very important advantages of GraphQL is the developer experience, right? GraphQL helps you escape a lot of unnecessary work, a lot of repetitive work like data fetching, passing on the data, storing the data, naming the data, and whatnot. So if you use a client-side library like Apollo or Urkel, they have already implemented caching for you. They store the data, they store the queries, and there are also features like automatically updating them throughout the UI whenever a mutation occurs and all. A lot of cool stuff. So they'll have to integrate with, I'd suggest Apollo for now, because that is the primary client-side library. But to use GraphQL on the front end, there has to be a library, like, because that is one of the most important advantages, I'd say.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was going to ask about the client. So yeah, that gives us a nice understanding, kind of like, to get up and running, the quickest use case. What about as far as documentation is concerned? Like, where should they go look to get started with all of this if they have any questions?
So we have a fairly decent documentation page. I won't say good, because documentation is never good. It always needs to get better. It's more of a journey than a destination. But just head to hasura.io. You'll find a docs link. Just head to our docs. And we have a super active, extremely supportive community on Discord. If you're on Reactive Flux, you're already on Discord. It should be like a single click to just add Hasura on your Discord as well. And whatever questions you have, especially on the client side, what kind of tools to use. So our documentation covers a lot of the server side use cases and how to set things up, but we're still adding a lot more tutorials for the client side of things, right? So if you find anything lacking, just hit us up on Discord, and somebody from the community or somebody from our team will help you out, and you won't have to wait longer than a few hours for having your query solved. So on average, we get back to people within an hour or so, or somebody gets back to people within an hour or so, but you never have to wait for more than 6-7 hours. And that's the fastest way to kind of get started, get productive. Don't worry about asking questions. If you're new to GraphQL, if you're new to integrating the client in your React or React Native application, you don't have to feel shy at all. Just go ahead, ask us stuff. We have a bunch of experts. Rishi has been working with React Native for a long time. He's super helpful. So hit us up there, DM us, talk on the general channel, and that's one of the fastest ways of getting started if you're new to the ecosystem.
Also check out our blogs. We write a lot of blogs.
So yeah, we do have a lot. Yeah, we have a lot of blogs and a lot of tutorials. Not enough, but we're getting there. All of them are linked centrally through the documentation. So once you head there, it should be easy.
All right, very cool. So I think we're getting close to being up on time. But before we get to our picks, is there anything you wanted to talk about before we start wrapping it up?
No, I think we're good. I think I would just encourage everybody to try Hasura out, to try GraphQL out if they haven't already, and hit us up on Discord if you run into any issues or whatever feedback you have. We're a super young project, so whatever you have to say will be super valuable for us.
Yeah, just saying this, try out GraphQL. It is a slow learning curve, but yeah, it is a fun experience as a developer.
Yes, I agree. It's actually really nice once you start getting the hang of it, and it's really fun to actually use. So it's hard to go back to rest after that, actually.
Yeah.
So, Tanmai, do you have any picks for today?
Absolutely. I have picks on food and on reading something, if that's okay. Not a code pick. Is that okay?
Yeah, totally. One of mine has nothing to do with code.
Okay, cool. So on the food pick, I would recommend, if you've not had a South Indian breakfast before, I would recommend that you have a South Indian breakfast. Preferably with somebody who is South Indian or had South Indian breakfast before. It will be the most amazing experience of your life. If you're in the Bay Area, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter, and we will go spend this weekend and have a gigantic, amazing South Indian breakfast. So that's me on food. And on books, if you're looking at reading something new, please go ahead and read The Three-Body Problem. It's by a Chinese author called Cixin Liu. It's one of the most amazing science fiction books you will read in recent times. Super fun, very different, great read.
Very cool. I just added that book to my reading list. That sounds good. I needed another book to add, something that wasn't I was looking for something that was fiction because I have so much nonfiction.
Yeah.
So Rishi, do you have any picks today?
Okay, everybody should try out this workout program called Strong Lifts. Let's go for it. It'll change your life. That's about it.
I think I've heard of Strong Lifts. What does it do?
Well, it is a workout program which is not bodybuilding. It is for building overall athleticism and strength. So if you are not totally into bodybuilding and you just want to have a fit lifestyle, that is the program for you. You'll get really strong, and you'll also enjoy life because you just have to work out thrice a week.
That's not bad. I think I can work out twice a week.
Yeah, I can work out 0 times a week too. I mean, that sounds perfect.
Yeah.
So I have 2 picks. I guess the first one is non-code related at all. It is, I got to visit Stockholm, Sweden a few days ago, and I've been to Europe so many times recently, but I was really impressed by Stockholm. I thought it was like a really beautiful city, a lot of nice architecture, a lot of good culture. I would totally say that if you have an opportunity and you're looking for somewhere different to travel and you're in Europe, check out Stockholm. We have an AWS loft there, which is pretty cool, which is basically a co-working space / meeting space. It's kind of open to the public if you're an AWS customer. I think it's a pop-up loft, so it's going to be closed by the time this episode comes out, but we may be doing another one sometime there. And then my second pick is, since we're talking about GraphQL, we have a GraphQL publication called Open GraphQL. And there we have tutorials and blog posts around everything in the GraphQL community. So if you're looking to learn stuff about GraphQL, check out and subscribe to the Open GraphQL publication on Medium. So that kind of wraps up this episode of React Native Radio. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks for having us, Nara. It was great.
Great to be here. Yeah.
Well, we enjoyed it. We learned a lot. This episode is, I think, episode 113 or something like that. So we're kind of getting along in episodes these days. So thanks for coming on, and thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you all next week.